child's health doesn't start when a woman becomes pregnant. Mm-hmm. It starts before the woman becomes pregnant.
Right.
Mm-hmm. It's critical that if someone is planning to become pregnant, that they prepare themselves. You know, we have terrible infant mortality results in the United States. Mm-hmm. One of the reasons is that we don't give great health care to people who are pregnant, and that's primarily a monetary issue. It's mm-hmm. not that we don't have the specialists who can provide the health care. We don't have the funds so that everyone can avail it. Effort, therefore, should be that if you're thinking of getting pregnant, you need to say, do I want to do what's best for my child? Mm-hmm. And if I want to do what's best for my child, I need to take care of myself and prepare. Certain children don't play in particular activities because getting touched or getting hit by a dodgeball or something like that, mm-hmm. it triggers side effects and symptoms that they cannot tolerate. Mm-hmm. So if we, as parents, decide to play a more active role in our children's lives, mm-hmm. and make sure that we just don't put them in front of the TV on Saturday mornings to watch cartoons, mm-hmm. you know, mm-hmm. and don't give them a cell phone, to mollify their interests, mm-hmm.
We will see certain behaviors in children that can help us better understand what's evolving in their health.
Sure.
At this moment, we know that approximately 6% of the entire population has fibromyalgia.
Children
That's
and
huge.
adults.
That's right, 6%.
Whoa.
That in the United States alone, we're talking about 20 million people.
Yeah.
Now, if you understand all immune-related diseases in the United States, it could be as high as 180 million if you add all the diseases. So I'm familiar with approximately 10 diseases. We're talking about fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue and chronic pain, mental depression, chronic anxiety, brain fog, sleeplessness, long COVID, and interstitial cystitis. So if you add all those problems together, you're looking between 150 and 180 million Americans who may have one of these immune dysfunctional processes.
And we're very pleased to welcome our guest today, Dr. Bruce Gillis, a trailblazing physician and immunology expert dedicated to unraveling immune system dysfunction and its profound impact on health. As founder and CEO of Epic Genetics, he developed the Be Sure test, the world's first blood test to identify fibromyalgia biomarkers, bringing clarity and hope to those with chronic conditions. Dr. Gillis's groundbreaking research spans a wide range of immune-related issues, from chronic fatigue and pain to long COVID, brain fog, anxiety, IBS, and depression. His focus on the gut microbiome is a critical part of immune health, includes screening for damaging compounds and promoting natural solutions to restore balance safely and effectively. Committed to lifelong immune health, Dr. Gillis emphasizes early detection and intervention, highlighting how addressing immune imbalances from childhood can enhance physical and emotional well-being. Today, he joins the first 7 years to share insights on building healthier futures for children and families through the power of immune science. Welcome.
Yeah, welcome. So I would say this is probably going to be one of our most important episodes. It's groundbreaking. What you're doing is trailblazing and leading. Can't wait to dive right into this and all
Absolutely.
about the immune system.
Yeah. So what if the roots of chronic conditions like fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue syndrome actually begin in childhood? In this episode, Dr. Bruce Gillis explores the possibility of identifying early immune imbalances in children, and from that understanding, subtle signs to uncovering immune dysfunction. Dr. Gillis offers a unique perspective on how families can advocate for better health outcomes, even when research in this area is scarce.
Absolutely. And we're going to unpack the science of immune imbalances. We're going to discuss how early intervention awareness could change the trajectory of many children's lives and families from 0 to 7 and beyond. But before we do, you've got some thoughts on the topic, in particular from a naturopathic doctor's perspective, functional medicine doctor's perspective. So let's just dive right into that before we start our conversation with Dr. Gillis here. What can you tell us about the prevalence of immune conditions in children, Dr. Murray?
So if we look at this, and this is looking at the latest American statistics, and this is across the board. Earlier in other episodes, we've looked at, mental health, ADHD, the rates increases 300, 400, 500%. If we look at immune dysfunctions in children, we see the same rise in the number of children being affected by these immune disorders, especially like the allergy disorders, which include eczema, food allergies, environment allergies. So we see, 1 in 3 U.S. children reporting having some sort of seasonal allergy, which reflects a dysfunctioning immune system.
And of course, we appreciate correlation is not causation, but this is so tightly paralleled, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. And when you see increases like this over the last 30, 40 years, we know something's going on.
Right.
With the immune system, just a very top level look at it, we've got really 2 parts. We have the innate and adaptive, and Dr. Gillis is going to explain to us all exactly what those components are, how they work, how they develop, the importance of both functioning together. It's like 2 arms on a person. And the understanding that once that umbilical cord is cut, once that infant is delivered, now the immune system is going to start functioning independently.
Right.
Prior to that, all with the mother, now stepping out into the world. How does that immune system start from there and develop healthy? If we look, the next one, we see in the same way that we call this the first 7 years, because so much of what happens in those first 7 years sets the platform for everything else in a child's life. Immune system, microbiome, brain health, brain growth. So again, those first 7 years and what happens, what that immune system experiences, what support it gathers, what challenges it faces, is really going to create that immune system for the rest of the child's life.
I love this quote here by Aristotle. Give me a child until he is 7 and I will show you the man. That encapsulates it right there, doesn't it?
And, when we really start looking a little deeper with the immune system, we see, 80 to 90% of it is actually wrapped around, developed, and sitting within the microbiome, small intestine, large intestine, which is why, the microbiome and the immune system are so closely related, depending on each other to function properly. So we'll look at that more. And, we can come back to this more at the end when we're looking at what nutrients, what supplements can help the immune system. But let's start, Dr. Gillis, in terms of your perspective, and a child is born, what are the most important things that should happen at that point? What should be in place? And how does it go well? And how can it go askew?
When you're talking about the immune system, the first 2 aspects are either innate or acquired. The innate is what starts happening after the child is delivered. The acquired is what we as physicians and healthcare professionals can help to boost the child's well-being. For example, the use of vaccinations, things like that. So those are the most important things. The other thing is, though, a child's health doesn't start when a woman becomes pregnant. It starts before the woman becomes pregnant.
Right.
It's critical that if someone is planning to become pregnant, that they prepare themselves. We have terrible infant mortality results in the United States. One of the reasons is that we don't give great health care to people who are pregnant. And it's primarily a monetary issue. It's not that we don't have the specialists who can provide the health care. We don't have the funds so that everyone can avail it. And the effort, therefore, should be that if you're thinking of getting pregnant, you need to say, do I want to do what's best for my child? And if I want to do what's best for my child, I need to take care of myself and prepare. in one of your earlier episodes, I listened carefully to the use of, for example, of taking certain vitamins and supplements like iron. Excuse me, and vitamin D and other things like that. So that's critical. When it comes to exposures for children, we know that there are things that you cannot plan for, right? There's no way you can prevent your child, for example, from getting a respiratory tract infection. Oftentimes we use preschools, which are a wonderful breeding ground for infections. In fact, years ago, I briefly taught elementary school, and that's when I was the sickest because of all the things I was exposed to, in that regard. In my area of expertise and where we've been doing research, we are looking at disease processes that are not limited to adults, that they happen in children. For example, you know that I've done a great deal of research in a disease called fibromyalgia, where fibromyalgia has been described as a bogus affliction of neurotic, hypochondriacal, hysterical women. Our research at the University of Illinois College of Medicine, where we've had a number of publications, has proven that the disease is a disease of the white blood cells, and that's innate immunity, right? And recently we are seeing now links to communicable diseases like long COVID, which leads us to suspect that certain diseases like fibromyalgia and potentially chronic fatigue, et cetera, could be triggered by viruses that lead to a change in a person's DNA. That's the process of epigenetics, EPI, epigenetics. And as a matter of fact, I have recently submitted a publication identifying that patients with long COVID have the same characteristics of fibromyalgia. Other people have written about it, but until applying our tests, we'd never had objective confirmation. We now have that. And when it comes to a pediatric population, I can tell you from personal experience, these diseases can start manifesting themselves. I've seen it as early as age 3. And as I also mentioned in our recent conversation, you can start screening for these manifestations in children when they're in elementary school. I think it still happens that during recess, certain children don't play in particular activities because getting touched or getting hit by a dodgeball or something like that triggers side effects and symptoms that they cannot tolerate. So if we as parents decide to play a more active role in our children's lives and make sure that we just don't put them in front of the TV on Saturday mornings to watch cartoons, and don't give them a cell phone, to mollify their interests. We will see certain behaviors in children that can help us better understand what's evolving in their health.
Sure. That makes good sense. Well, let's take it back before we dive too deep into the syndromes, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue. What are some of the early signs that parents need to look for in children that may be suspect of immune imbalance? I mean, Dr. Murray showed a slide a little earlier about the gut. We'll get into that as well. Gut-associated lymphoid tissue and that whole interchange of information going down in the microbiome. But it's not just the gut. It's not just the skin. It's what are the symptoms that we should be cognizant of?
The first major symptom that we see in people is lack of energy, chronic fatigue. It presents. We also have issues of poor sleep. We have issues of poor school performance. In adults, we call that brain fog, but here it's difficulties with concentration. So we focus. You can see anxiety. You can see depression. Those are the common signs that I would be screening for initially. And if a child is not progressing well in their schoolwork, you have to understand why is that happening.
Right.
Think there's a saying in medicine: when you hear hoofbeats, don't think of zebras, think of horses. So before you start saying, "Oh, my son or my daughter is not doing well in school," it must be autism. No, don't think of the weird or the rare. Think about the commonplace. And an immune system basis is something that we should be carefully looking for and screening for.
Absolutely. And in other episodes, we've talked how closely related the health of the microbiome is to the immune system and to the brain. So there's this triad, brain function, immune function, microbiome function. Would you like to speak to that a little more?
Everybody wants a healthy microbiome, and for people listening, I think we have an obligation to define what the microbiome is, all right?
Yeah.
And there isn't just one single microbiome, all right? The immune system has many different parts. Among the parts we call the microbiome, wherever you have an opening in your body, you have a microbiome, okay? So you have a microbiome in your nostrils and in your ears and in your mouth and in your colon or large intestine or your rectum or for a woman in her vaginal area. So we have lots of microbiomes, and we have a general microbiome on our skin.
Ears, eyes.
Yes, ears, wherever there's a place where microorganisms can gather. Now, we like to think that the microorganisms are all healthy and will protect us. Unfortunately, it doesn't always work that way. And one of the reasons I think it doesn't work that way is we tend to expose our children to microorganisms that are unhealthy or to medications that can adversely affect them, all right? For example, we think about the skin microbiome. Make sure, even though you may not be in Hawaii, make sure that they have enough of a skin protectant on their skin to protect against UV rays. It's nice and simple, right? If you think that your child is ill and you need to give them some medication, make sure that you understand whether the medication can be damaging. And if it is, you could still give it to them, but you need to be prudent, so that you deal with the problem acutely, so you don't develop what will ultimately become a chronic manifestation because you've damaged the microbiome.
Sure. So that you're sort of referring to antibiotics as one of the key...
Antibiotics. Well, I want children to take antibiotics if they have an infection, obviously. But the most common use compound in children tend to be things like aspirin or anti-inflammatories or acetaminophen, things like that. Certainly you need to deal with things like fevers, and you want to follow the doctor's recommendation. But you don't want to go overboard. That's the problem. Some people think that, well, if it helped me in 2 days, I should take it for 7 days. Not necessarily required, and certainly could be damaging in the future.
Sure.
You said something really interesting a minute ago about if you hear hoofs, think horses, not zebras. And then you referenced some of the more unusual, statistically, I'm assuming you're saying, conditions like don't think, maybe autism spectrum, but think fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue. I think it's interesting for folks at home to understand what incidence is around CFS, FMS in children, younger populations. If you're thinking, or if you're saying to us that these are really much more common than we believe.
At this moment, we know that approximately 6% of the entire population has fibromyalgia.
Children
That's
and
huge.
adults?
That's right, 6%. That in the United States alone, we're talking about 20 million people. Now, if you understand all immune-related diseases in the United States, it could be as high as 180 million if you add all the diseases. So I'm familiar with approximately 10 diseases. We're talking about fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue and chronic pain, mental depression, chronic anxiety, brain fog, sleeplessness, long COVID, and interstitial cystitis, which is a urologic problem. So if you add all those problems together, you're looking between 150 and 180 million Americans who may have one of these immune dysfunctional processes. And it's not hard to understand. You don't need to go to Dr. Google, all right? You can go to a free website called PubMed, PUBMED.gov, and just put in the disease and then put in microbiome or immune system, and you'll be amazed how many articles are available that you can understand.
Sure. Showing the origin, the link, the connection between these chronic inflammatory, diseases that have a common origin.
Well, they're not necessarily inflammatory. For example, fibromyalgia is not necessarily an inflammatory disease, and it's clearly not an autoimmune disease. In fibromyalgia, we have a defect in a particular type of white blood cell. It's called the peripheral blood mononuclear cell. And these cells are incapable of manufacturing normal quantities of 4 critical proteins. And in research that we published earlier this year in one of the world's most important journals, Nature, we've identified that 100% of people who test positive based upon our blood test have unique DNA genomic signatures. So that means that not only is it a real disease, unless, of course, you don't believe in DNA, but it also means that to understand how to manage the disease, you have to look at various pathways. For example, we can't change your DNA, right? If you have blue eyes, we can't give you brown eyes or vice versa, right? So there's lots of different diseases, and we need to make sure that when we are interested in treating these diseases, we understand these pathways. You know, there are lots of medications on the market that have nothing to do with the immune system, but yet have been used or even approved for use. In fibromyalgia, there are 3 approved drugs. 1 is an anti-seizure medicine and 2 are antidepressant medicines, none of which have any immune benefits whatsoever.
You made an interesting supposition, observation. You know, the kid that's in school doesn't want to participate in dodgeball because they're sensitive. But they're not just maybe non-athletic. They're physically, maybe even as well emotionally, because you're making the connection, you're sensitive. What are some of the other signs and signals? Of course, besides this wonderful paper, Identification of Unique Genomic Signatures in Patients, so it's testable, we'll talk about that. But just observing your child, what are some of the other known signs and symptoms that parents at home can sort of think, oh, this might actually be fibromyalgia with my child, not avoidance of dodgeball?
Well, before we use the word fibromyalgia, you need to understand that it's a made-up name. There is nothing wrong with the fibrous or connective tissue, nor the myalgic or muscle tissue. In fact, when people have undergone biopsies of areas where they have pain, we see no pathologic features whatsoever. It really should be called an immune deficiency disorder, because that's what it is, okay? Fibromyalgia is a colloquial term, and it was given by doctors to particularly women who were complaining, and they just decided, we'll give them that name. We've had other names before that. There was fibrositis, was one of the other names. So we've had lots of names.
Or just hypochondriacal.
Or hypochondriasis. You know, when I first got in the field, I was flabbergasted to go to support groups and hear over and over again how doctors ridiculed these patients for their illnesses. In these diseases, at least in adults, you know, they look healthy, they seem healthy. So doctors discount the nature of their symptoms. Friends and family and even spouses will say there can't be anything wrong with you. And then, of course, there has never been anything curative or truly effective for therapy for these people. And as a consequence, these patients, at least as adults, have among the highest levels of suicide and suicidal ideation, exceeding mental depression, because doctors don't believe them, family and friends don't believe them, and they can't find any method to cope and deal with their diseases.
And the discomfort.
But getting back to your issue with children, I think that the first thing you should see is the level of activity of children. Are children showing a lot of energy, a lot of interest, okay? Those are important signs and symptoms. Do they want to join in activities both at school and in their home life? And do they complain about not sleeping well, or they feel depressed or seem anxious? These are common things that we can easily screen for. And fortunately for us, our blood test is highly accurate, and we've tested many children and have identified fibromyalgia. We don't find it in everybody with these symptoms, obviously, but we do see it in a sizable percentage of these children. And so screening is very important. Unfortunately, the pediatric population hasn't quite caught on about this in children, but it is clearly prevalent.
Sure. And could you speak then to sort of understanding this perspective, the prevalence of it, the sort of ambiguity of the signs and symptoms, and then in terms of you being able to identify it through a test, and then understanding, which part, what mechanism of the immune system has actually gone awry that's allowed this to develop or developing.
Well, we have some working hypotheses.
Sure.
Obviously, there is something going on in the manufacturing of those peripheral blood mononuclear cells. So that's in the bone marrow. All right? And as I've already said, we know that people with the disease have a unique DNA genomic signature between 1 and 3, and 100% of them have those DNA signatures. Okay?
Yep.
We're not able to change your DNA, but the prevalence of the symptoms is what you should look at. Okay, if a child always seems depressed or anxious, okay, before we start saying, it's because of issues with siblings or problems at school with other children, we should look at more organic causes, okay? More physiologic processes. That's what we should be looking at. Will we always see it as one of the diseases I've mentioned? Not necessarily, but we do have to be aware of the potential existence of this. That, as I said, these are diseases that are not gender specific and they're not age specific. The reason why we tend to see more people diagnosed who are elderly is because they have health insurance and can afford to work up the evaluation. That's really it. So they have Medicare, for example, so we see more elderly patients. But it's not a disease that is age specific whatsoever. And if indeed we're dealing with a viral mechanism as triggering this, children get respiratory tract infections as often as adults, right?
Yep.
And based upon our linkage now between these same pathways and long COVID, that means that we have a linkage to a coronavirus. There are 7 human coronaviruses, and any of them potentially can be the source of an epigenetic change that can produce a side effect in children.
Gotcha. So something comes along, trips up the immune system, that glitch, that switch that happens then switches over to this other condition.
That's correct. That's exactly it. That's something that the DNA triggers something that is reflected in what's going on in the bone marrow and in the production of these faulty white blood cells.
Got it.
I would also argue, maybe you'll correct me if I'm wrong in my postulation here, that children can't communicate this variety of sort of ambiguous symptomatology, how they're feeling until, older ages. We're all about 0 to 7 here, but they're barely of age at 7 to describe how they feel insofar as somebody experiencing the typical symptoms of fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, and the history of the nomenclature of somebody with hypochondria, somebody who complains of all things. Just want to tie this interesting concept together. This is an anatomy. Somebody came in complaining about everything to do with their gut, what we now call irritable bowel syndrome, and something's wrong. I just don't feel well. I'm tired. I have chronic fatigue. What did we call them? Hypochondriacs. There's an anatomy to this, and it's in this area. But now what we know is that so much of the immune system, as you were saying earlier, ties into this. So in fact, it's not in their head. It was in their gut.
Yes, but it is in their head.
Well,
okay, and I'll tell you, one of the issues is instead of looking at some things that are now we know are physiologic, we're looking at psychologic. Now, I'm not saying that there isn't a role for child psychologists and child psychiatrists. Of course there is. But the point is, if they have certain diseases that overlap, there may be something organic here, something worth testing, okay? And that talk therapy is not necessarily going to overcome it if indeed they have developed this abnormal physiologic process with the peripheral blood mononuclear cells. And it can, you're right, it can manifest in irritable bowel. Children are very prone to abdominal cramps, abnormal bowel movements, things that we as adults call it irritable bowel, but these children have it too. And we know that there can be a link to the same pathways that are associated with the fibromyalgia group, or I should say family of disorders.
Right. So so tell us all about, we want to get into the nitty gritty about this Be Sure test. I mean, this is established in science. That's what you're all about. How this eventually gets adapted to identify immune imbalances in children, because it's not exclusive to the diagnoses of fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue.
No,
This is
no.
about identifying the mechanisms behind what is immune imbalance.
So I and colleagues at the University of Illinois College of Medicine decided to get involved in this because of the financial impact of the disease, and not in the way that you would think. We were approached, or I should say, I was approached by one of the world's largest insurance companies who had sold long-term disability policies to adults. And all of a sudden, they were getting people in their 20s and 30s saying, I've been diagnosed with fibromyalgia. I want my benefits. Okay? And the insurance company said, well, we don't think this disease exists, and we don't want to pay the benefits. Surprise, surprise, which unfortunately is quite topical given what just happened last week with an insurance executive, right? So at that time, I was like the majority of healthcare practitioners. I was called a fibroskeptic, didn't believe in the disease. There was nothing objective. We decided, I and my team of researchers at the university decided that we need to identify a pathway or pathways that affect people from head to toe, because they have symptoms literally from head to toe, as I've described. And the first thought was, let's look at the body's immune system, because it does affect you from head to toe, correct? The insurance company arranged for us to speak to 17 people who'd filed for long-term disability. We obtained blood specimens from them. We matched them by age, gender, ethnicity, et cetera, to 17 healthy people, and we measured 15 different parameters, immune system parameters. And the results were stunning. You did not need to do a statistical analysis to prove that there was something different among these patients versus healthy people. We then went on and did a very large study with over 200 people, and we published our results. But publishing was difficult because intrinsic into the healthcare system were quote-unquote fibromyalgia specialists who'd spent their lives trying to prove that it was either autoimmune or neurologic or psychiatric or rheumatologic. And when it came to taking our publication and going through peer review, we had a great deal of difficulty because it meant that many specialists in this arena had gone down an incorrect pathway. We had found a new science, essentially, and it meant that their devotion to what they proposed, their hypotheses, was now wrong. Nevertheless, we did get published, and we won an award, a national award for outstanding research in clinical immunology. We then got some criticism saying, well, you did this only in one laboratory, as if the Department of Pathology at the University of Illinois was somehow deficient, which is a bit absurd. So I joined with one of the world's most important rheumatologists, a professor at UCLA, and we did the study all over again using a different laboratory. And guess what? The results were the same. Only this time we proved that it wasn't a disease of rheumatology and that it had no connection to autoimmune rheumatologic diseases like rheumatoid arthritis or lupus, and we've continued to publish our results. And interestingly, we have found some unique characteristics. As you know, when long COVID hit the population, we had a very high level of morbidity and mortality. But in looking at 7,000 of our patients who had fibromyalgia proven by blood test, we had 0 deaths due to COVID and only 1 hospitalization. So interestingly, having fibromyalgia protects you from dying from COVID because in COVID, it triggers an immunologic response, and you overproduce certain inflammatory proteins, cytokines. They swamp your lungs, you get pneumonia, and you die because of that. But these patients can't produce normal quantities of these cytokines, and therefore, that's right, and they don't get fatal pneumonia. So I thought that was, and we published those results as well. In that regard, we have continued to work in this arena. And we have now found a pathway by acting on the microbiome to attenuate manifestations of people with chronic fatigue and discomfort and brain fog. And I recently completed a clinical trial with over 200 people, and this has been effective. And it is a natural compound that we find in tap water and in the soil, and it works on the microbiome.
Yep. So you're affecting the immune system through the introduction of this into the microbiome.
Yes, what we've been able to do through research we also published, we've been able to show that this natural compound causes those defective white blood cells to increase their production level of the abnormal levels of chemokines and cytokines. So by increasing those levels, we have been able to restore the well-being of these individuals.
So to bring back balance into
That's
that
exactly
system.
correct. Yes.
Excellent. Excellent. So very big work, very big subject, very big advance, for a lot of people to understand that there is something that can be so effective.
Yes, and it's important to realize that it's not hereditary. Okay,
Sure.
I think I need to mention that, that if you suspect your child has it, you don't have to think, well, that's something that I gave them.
Sure.
It's not that way at all. This is not a heritable disease at all.
Right.
I think that's really good news, and I think that the obviously and congratulations, kudos, really. I mean, the science is obviously impeccable, and also it's offering a lot of hope to people out there that thought within this 6% you're describing, which is actually astronomically higher than I thought, but there's hope and treatment. And you mentioned this heat-killed bacteria. Describe a little bit more
Sure.
about exactly what this is, and also maybe some age ranges and applications and so forth of this Imbix.
So as it turns out, we have been looking at ways to manipulate the immune system to combat various diseases. And one of the ways is in cancer patients. There has been studies going back probably almost 30 years. This was done in Europe, looking at non-toxic mycobacteria that could provoke an immune response.
Sure.
And they tested it in terminal cancer patients. And they looked at two particular strains, Mycobacteria obuense and Mycobacteria vaccae, with the hope that they could find a ability for terminal patients to respond better to anti-cancer chemotherapeutic agents. Based upon that, I decided to take a look with colleagues at the University of Illinois College of Pharmacy to look at other members of the non-toxic mycobacteria strain. Now, for those people who don't know what mycobacteria is, there are two particular diseases of mycobacteria that we all have some familiarity with. One is Mycobacteria tuberculosis, and the other one, which affects humans, and then we have Mycobacteria bovis, which is tuberculosis in cows, and that's one of the reasons why we pasteurize milk to kill any of those organisms. Okay. We looked at 7 different strains. We isolated defective peripheral blood mononuclear cells from patients with fibromyalgia, and we challenged those cells with these 7 different strains of mycobacteria. And the one that was most effective is called Mycobacteria smegmatis, which is found in tap water, is found in soil, and we decided to test this as a supplement. Why as a supplement? Well, if you're already exposed to this in drinking water, right? And as far as we know, there is no common reason for people to feel threatened by drinking tap water, right? If tap water is handled properly, you shouldn't get any illnesses, right? So since we already know that it exists in tap water, we felt that it should be non-toxic. And if it's in tap water, how do we get it into the system? We get it into the system in that microbiome in the colon. So we, after doing our research on those white blood cells, we put this material into a capsule. And we did it in a way to protect the people. We heat killed it. In other words, it has no possibility of having untoward effects. And now I can tell you that thousands of doses have been taken and we have had no recorded untoward effects. And we put it in a special capsule that does not get absorbed in the stomach, doesn't get absorbed until it gets to the colon.
Yep.
And the response has been remarkable in that regard. This is not a drug. It is a natural supplement.
That's right.
And that's important for people to realize. And we've learned that it has more benefits than just what I said about things like fatigue or poor sleep. We have found people who have gastrointestinal issues, as we have described, of cramps and pain and abnormal bowel habits. If you go to our website, you will see a number of testimonials where we have done videos of these people talking about the efficacy of this compound.
Sure. So to put it in perspective, that most people I think understand, like in the microbiome we have prebiotics, which sort of set the foundation for the probiotics to live and cultivate and do their work. So we have prebiotics, we have probiotics, and we also have postbiotics. And this is what you're talking about here, is a postbiotic that goes in, activates something in the microbiome with the white blood cells, and then creates balance where there was disbalance and dysregulation before.
That's correct.
And this is a real systems approach. I mean, what you've done is, beginning to end, the Be Sure test can establish whether or not there is some degree of immune imbalance, evidence-based establishment. And then if that is the case, there's a problem. Now you've got a solution. And I'm not suggesting that Imbix is the end all and be all, and I wanted to go to you actually for some establishment around what other things people can and should do, 0 to 7. But this sounds like this heat-killed specific bacteria postbiotic sounds like it could be a solution for a lot of folks that are suffering from, to your point, the testimonials are testimonials, but it could end up being revolutionary.
What's interesting about this is we tell people, we don't want you to use it unless you actually feel something. Right. People take all sorts of vitamins and supplements and feel nothing. There's no way to judge whether it's helping them in the long term, correct? In our world, we say to people, if you take this and after being on it for 3 or 4 weeks, you're not noticing anything different, we want you to reassess why that is. The most common reason is that people are taking certain things or maintaining certain habits that are damaging the microbiome. So, for example, we find people taking all sorts of over-the-counter drugs that will inhibit the efficacy of Imbix. Imbix is meant to boost the microbiome. And I use a numerical scale, even though it is something that I can't tie in with a specific number. But let's say if Imbix can boost your immune system by a factor of 50, that's great. But if you're taking something that causes damage to the microbiome, and that process is called dysbiosis, D-Y-S-B-I-O-S-I-S, and that gives you a negative 50, you take the Imbix and you're taking that, you're still at 0. You're not going to feel anything.
Yeah. You negate the ability of the other thing to do something.
That's exactly correct.
Yeah. So let's go back then, in terms of, because obviously it works better if the microbiome is in balance. If the microbiome is healthy, the healthier the microbiome is, the more effective the Imbix is going to be.
Absolutely.
Right? So in children, let's just go back to the very beginning. What creates that healthy microbiome from the start?
Obviously, having a good diet is critical, all right?
Yeah.
And that's a real problem at this moment. It's a problem because of the stress on parents for time and stress on parents for economics, right? We're dealing with a high inflation period, and oftentimes people don't necessarily buy the healthiest foods. They don't buy fresh fruits and vegetables.
I was going to say, not to mention food deserts.
That's right, and food deserts. You're absolutely correct. That's a problem. or they rely on fast food restaurants, not necessarily very good, okay? And that you need to make sure that whatever you're putting in your child's stomach, whether it's food or another product, you need to ask your pediatrician when they prescribe it for you or recommend it for you, you need to say, how will it affect my child beyond this acute manifestation? Learn about what the microbiome is. We've talked about the microbiome. There's multiple microbiomes, but now we're talking about the gastrointestinal tract / colon microbiome. So that's important that we educate the parents because the child's not going to be able to make that decision, correct? So that's very important. And in selecting how we choose our diet, we have to do it based not solely because something tastes sweet, right? But that it could taste healthy, all right? Those are important things.
No, absolutely agree. I think, that is why food and diet is like the basis of good health. Now we understand because that's what's establishing and feeding the microbiome. That's our foundation. That's the platform that a child starts with. So if we can understand, and I think it's becoming more and more well known, I think people are becoming familiar with the word microbiome and actually what that means, the importance of it. So, in addition to healthy food, whole foods, unprocessed foods, don't swamp them with sugar, which actually can negate the microbiome and the bacterial field there. Then, there are other supplements that can be used to help if a child does need, to help repair or replace, in the microbiome. And so here we just sort of look at some of the key ones. This is where we go back. Prebiotics, probiotics, postbiotics. Those are the active entities in the microbiome. Colostrum, that first, before the mother's milk and she starts nursing, colostrum, the first 2 to 3 days comes in, also establishing the base, that ecology for the microbiome. And in terms of vitamins and minerals, we really understand now that the antioxidants play a key part. So especially, vitamin A, B, C, D, and E. And then the antioxidant and immune minerals, the iron, the selenium, and the zinc, also very important. So I think if we keep that perspective of with our children, like from the very beginning, what we doing, what we providing them, is it helping their microbiome? That is the first sort of point where we can start preventatively maintaining a healthy microbiome, healthy immune system, and hopefully avoid a lot of these consequential immune imbalances.
Yes, but when we use those compounds, we have to do it judiciously, as much as a certain vitamin or supplement may help. I often have people say, well, I took one of these pills, so 2 or 3 pills a day would be even better. Yeah. It doesn't always work that way.
Absolutely.
They have to use it judiciously and understand the pros and cons of whatever we take in our body.
There's no question. At the first 7 years, we get a lot of questions coming through social media, Instagram, Facebook, primarily some Twitter. Have a couple of questions for you, some of which I know you've answered in part and some in full, but just to reiterate, and this is a really important one, and that it is from Susan on Facebook, who asks, how do frequent infections in childhood relate to potential immune imbalances? I wonder if she's even asking the question to suggest that, again, kind of we talked about this at the top, maybe getting frequent infections. There's a point at which these infections are too frequent, obviously, but there's a healthy balance here. Like you kind of want kids to get sick, just not too sick.
Well, I understand, but you need to understand why they're getting sick,
right.
Okay? For example, another area that I've done a great deal of research is in environmental contamination, okay? As we know, we're going through huge changes because of global warming. We're getting all sorts of more storms. We're getting contamination of buildings and residences, and mold starts growing, and children are exposed to these in and out. And it doesn't merely happen at home. I've been involved in issues where schools oftentimes, for economic reasons, bought these trailers And the trailer is nothing more than a metal box that leaks.
And incubates mold.
And it incubates mold, and the children get very, very ill. So if a child has chronic illness over and over again, you need to say, what are they exposed to and who they are exposed to? So yes, many diseases are communicable, but many of these diseases are environmental as well.
Sure.
And we have a responsibility to investigate that.
Yep.
Such a great point.
No, absolutely. It's as if something is simmering underneath that's constantly stressing the immune system, then they won't be as capable if something acute comes along to deal with it, because the immune system's already tied up dealing with it subacute.
Right. And if you keep feeding your child, certain products thinking it's going to overcome it, you're dealing with the symptom and not the disease.
Sure.
Interesting. And, we talked about Be Sure. Love it. People should know about it. But Jody from Facebook's asking, are there specific tests parents should request from their pediatrician to evaluate their child's immune health at an early age? I mean, I get it. It's prohibitively invasive to be doing blood draws on a 2-year-old just to look at their white blood cell count. But are there non-invasive tests that parents could suggest their pediatricians do more?
In general, there are not. The issue is document the chronicity of the problems that they're experiencing. Obviously, if a child's not verbal, that's quite difficult, okay? But you need to determine why a child is continually being symptomatic. There's got to be a reason. That is not normal, all right? It's certainly not normal. And before you entertain our test, there are more rudimentary tests, like a simple blood count, for example. And for that, you don't have to do anything more than a very small little pinprick. That it's not going to cause any significant discomfort to the child. But there are screening tests that I'm sure every pediatrician is fully aware of that could be done in that regard. But there is something wrong if a child is sick over and over and over again. And remember what I just said earlier. When you hear hoofbeats, don't think of zebras. There could be something very common that's going on in the environment that is triggering this process.
So look for root causes.
Yes.
And maybe if they're opting out too frequently in gym class from dodgeball.
Another sign and symptom. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That's exactly it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Enlightening stuff.
There is something I'd like to add.
Yeah.
If people are interested in what we're doing, they can go to our website, besuretest.com, and just send us an email. And I promise I or one of our other healthcare staff will respond. We respond all the time.
Excellent.
So if you have any questions, you can go to besuretest.com, or you can go to the product Imbix, imbxx.com, and we're happy to answer your questions.
Excellent.
And as a matter of fact, what we're also doing is, if you think you are suffering with these problems, we are providing the opportunity for a free trial where we'll give you Imbix for 30 days if indeed we can document that you are suffering with one of these immune dysfunctions. So you have no money out of pocket to try Imbix for the first time.
That's great.
Just quickly, safety, efficacy, that's clear. How young can kids take Imbix?
Well, we're just starting to deal with pediatric population in our study, because we had to follow government guidelines. That's called an institutional review board guidelines. We needed to have a breakdown where we had a pediatric population was excluded. So ages 1 to 7 were not part of that. So I would tell you that we're willing to try and experiment with that. But since we know the compound is heat-killed, and since we've now had thousands of doses used, and we've not seen any untoward effects, I think it should be safe. And by the way, before we even did this, we did studies, required animal studies, where we were giving doses 10,000 times the dose that you would get by taking it orally in an adult. And we didn't kill one laboratory mouse whatsoever.
Excellent. No, this is really great information. I mean, it really is very, very few, I think, people, doctors, physicians, health practitioners are even aware of this work, this research that you've done. So I give you my kudos for doing this. It's not always easy to go against the tide. And thanks for being here with us today.
My pleasure.
Yeah.
These are patient-driven illnesses.
Mm-hmm.
And to that end, I would actually just add, for parents out there listening to this very important episode, ask your pediatrician to follow the science.
Mm-hmm.
Take a look at the Be Sure test.
Yeah.
And when you ask your physician to get involved rather than just acting exclusively, you're your best advocate for yourself and your children, no question. Yep. But then they may very likely not have heard of this test and solution.
Exactly.
And if you follow the science, it's irrefutable. So that's the advocacy suggestion that I have for parents listening in. If you suspect your child has an immune imbalance, this is a great place to start. So thanks so much for joining us today. Really appreciate it, Dr. Gillis.
Thank you for allowing me to be here and allowing me to talk to your listeners who are certainly concerned about the health and well-being of their children as well. They should be. And here's additional information. Science is not a dirty word. The definition of science is knowledge.
Sure.
And today you've allowed me to provide knowledge as you do in your continuing series. And for that, I want to thank you for everything you're doing.
Thank you, Dr. Gillis. Pleasure having you.
My pleasure.
And doctore is Latin for teacher. So thank you so much, Dr. Murray, for teaching us all. And thank you for joining us on the first 7 years. Don't forget to subscribe and share this episode to empower more parents with knowledge about immune health. And together we can help raise a healthier generation. Until next time, take care and stay connected.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.